My argument today will be that there isn't really much difference in a country's foreign policy if, in the case of Canada, the Tories or Liberals are in power, or in the case of Britain, where I come from, whether New Labour and the Conservatives are in power. Where the difference would be stark would be in the case of Britain if Old Labour came to power, and that is not likely, although they seem to be moving towards an Old Labour position with Jeremy Corbyn maybe becoming leader of the Labour Party, or in the case of Canada, the NDP. Why? Because the NDP and Old Labour in Britain are anti-American, anti-European Union, and, of course, more importantly, pro-Russian or willing to give Putin and Russian policy the benefit of the doubt. So really, we should be strategically voting to prevent, in the case of Canada, the NDP coming to power, and as I've done in Britain in my own case, to prevent Old Labour coming to power. Because that would be a disaster in both cases in terms of foreign policy. But and that would be even more the case if you had an NDP government in Canada and Donald Trump won the US presidency. Because then you would have two governments in the US and Canada who would be willing to give Vladimir Putin the benefit of the doubt. A complete disaster for Ukraine. But the reasons for this, why there isn't, I don't believe, much difference in terms of how a country's foreign policy would be affected if Liberals or Tories are in power in Canada, or New Labour or Tories in power in Britain. For that, we need to look back in history a bit to try to understand the dynamics taking place in Canada and in Britain. And I'll begin this really from the 1970s onwards, because up until the 1960s, Canada and Britain had very close relations. But it's really from the 1970s that they take separate paths, and their identities, Canadian and British, change very dramatically. In the case of Canada, it's the dropping of British national identity towards Prime Minister Trudeau's multiculturalism, and then the signing of the NAFTA trade agreement, which embeds Canada in North America very much, and realigns its trading patterns to what we have today, where 85% of Canadian trade is with the US. In the case of the United Kingdom, what happens in the 1970s is the country joins the European Union, and this is the time when I was growing up, and since then, Britain becomes, over the last 30, 40 years, a European country. There's a tremendous amount of Europeanization in the UK, lifestyle, food, travel, education, and even television and radio. In the case of Canada, I would say there's a North Americanization which has taken place. This doesn't mean to say Canadians become Americans. One thing coming to Canada which is very noticeable is how different Canadians are to the United States. But nevertheless, the area of focus from alignment with the British white commonwealth, where Canada is the leading country, the jewel in the crown of the white commonwealth, to a more North American identity takes place since the 1970s. Canada also doesn't go through the kind of political revolutions that have taken place in Britain since the 1980s, where the Conservatives went through the Thatcher Revolution, and that in turn provoked the Labour Party dumping Old Labour and creating New Labour under Tony Blair. That really hasn't taken place. So the Canada which existed until the 1960s, which punched above its waistline, with amazing leaders like Lester Pearson placing Canada on the international stage, that really is something of the past. From the 1970s and 80s, Canada is a far, far smaller international player. And just to put this in perspective, in the late 1940s, after World War II, Canada had the fourth largest air force, fourth largest armed forces, fifth largest navy, and the largest volunteer army ever fielded in history. So Canada was an international player. It was punching above its waist, which I would say today is not the case. Canada is punching below its waist. So with this more inward-looking foreign policy, which is compounded by the fact, I think, very few Canadians travel outside of North America on holiday. None of my Ukrainian friends or Canadian friends in Canada travel outside of the United States, maybe to Cuba at the very most, but they don't really travel very much internationally, which is very different to Europe. And this, in turn, with the growth of a replacement of British with multicultural identity, is a rather strange mix, because Canada is seen around the world as multicultural, but at the same time, the second largest province of Canada, Quebec, with a quarter of Canada's population, does not pursue a policy of multiculturalism, pursues a policy of French assimilationism. And also, one has to remember that Canada now is a lone star on multiculturalism around the world, perhaps together with Sweden. Most countries have dropped multiculturalism in the last decade in favour of integration. That was the case under Tony Blair, not the Tories, in Great Britain, following the terrorist attacks in London called 7/7. So with this more, I would say, movement away from the white British-led Commonwealth towards a more North American identity, Canada is very much, and very much was and is, in the shadow of the US, whereas previously it was in the shadow of Great Britain. To give an example of how that's been reflected today, Canadian military spending, which I don't think will change regardless of if the Liberals come to power and they replace the Tories, Canadian military spending today is the lowest in the last 50 years. NATO has 28 members, and Canada is sixth from the bottom in its military spending, with 1% of GDP spent on the military. Canadian military spending is less than that spent by Albania and Bulgaria in NATO. It's actually less than what Ukraine spends in terms of its proportion on GDP on the military. And the last time Canada really had a large military spending was in the sort of 60s and early 70s. The aim for NATO members is to spend 2% of their GDP on the military. Canada spends 1%. That's because it feels secure in the shadow of the United States. In terms of foreign aid, also, Canadians think they spend a lot on foreign aid, which is not the case. Canadians spend 0.24% of their gross national income on foreign aid, which is just slightly above what the US spends of 0.19%, 0.19%. So not that much more. The other interesting aspect is the international presence of Canada, which is a reflection of this, I would say, more weaker foreign policy and military policy. There is very little that ever appears about Canada, not only in the US media, which everybody jokes about, Rick Mercer talking to Americans and such like, but even in the British and other media outlets, such as The Economist, which I read every week, and the British Times and Guardian, which I read on a daily basis. Canadian news does not reach out, is not republished elsewhere. Also, Canada doesn't have any really major internationally recognized think tanks of the kind we see in Brussels, in London, and New York and Washington, D.C. There's no Canadian equivalent, for example, of Foreign Affairs, the very influential magazine published in the US by the Council on Foreign Relations. This, in turn, I think we should bear in mind, has been compounded by the Ukrainian diaspora. Because the Ukrainian diaspora in both Canada and the US has not invested in politics. What do I mean by it? It hasn't invested in encouraging young Ukrainian Canadians to go into politics and to go into journalism. And therefore there are very few members of the Canadian Parliament or Senate who are of Ukrainian Canadian background. That is not surprising in many ways, because the institutions that we invested into in academia in the United States and Canada tended to focus on culture, language, ethnic groups, ethnic culture, and also history, not on politics, not on political science. And this happened at a time when, since the 1980s and 90s, there's been a refocus of influence of ethnic groups amongst Canadian political parties, with the growth of South Asian and East Asian immigration coming into Canada. This has inevitably meant that they have the ear of politicians to maybe to a greater extent than East Europeans and Ukrainians. Let's not forget two other factors at work here as well. One factor which is generally across the case amongst young people everywhere, not just in Canada, young people today are not interested in politics in the way that were interested in politics when we were growing up. And that's true when you go around Sum or Place today. Young Ukrainian Canadians are not interested in politics in the same way we were. There is a peak in interest when there's like the Orange Revolution or Euromaidan, but on a general basis there isn't. And this was seen, I remember on the 24th of August last year, outside the Russian consulate in Toronto. There was a protest which I attended. This was in the week where Russia invaded Ukraine. You know, when Ukrainian forces were about to defeat the separatists and Russian forces invaded on the same day of Ukrainian independence. You would think there would be tens of thousands of people outside the Russian consulate because it's A, celebrating Ukrainian Independence Day, and B, Russia's invaded Ukraine. There were only 150 people there. This is Toronto. And most of those were from the new immigration which came to Canada. What has been surprising to me is how weak the Canadian Parliament has been in relation to what's happening in Washington, D.C. The Ukrainian lobby in Washington, D.C., not just Ukrainian Americans, but Americans who are interested in Ukraine, interested in countering Russia, interested in the geopolitical questions of Ukraine and Russia, have done far more in, for example, getting both houses of the US Congress to vote for the sending of military equipment to Ukraine, which President Obama has blocked until now, but both houses supported, Democrats and Republicans, and also in adopting last December the Ukrainian Freedom Act. The vote for military equipment being sent to Ukraine and the Ukrainian Freedom Act, neither of those have taken place in the Canadian Parliament in Ottawa. So therefore, I think that, yes, to sum up, yes, if the NDP came to power in Canada in the same way as if old Labour came to power in Britain, there would be a major problem for Ukraine in terms of the more anti-American, pro-Russian foreign policy or neutrality, however way it's defined. Old Labour in the 1980s was a mixture of unilateral nuclear disarmament, anti-NATO, anti-American, and thereby implicitly pro-Russian. But I really don't think there would be a major change in Canadian foreign policy if the Liberals were to defeat the Tories in the upcoming elections. Of course, it's important to get people like Chrystia Freeland and Boris Wisniewski into the Parliament. But they're lone individuals. They can do as much as they can, and they do a lot of good work. But they seem to be battling against a lot of passivity. And I was told, even in the case of Prime Minister Harper, who seems to be afraid of taking on Putin by sending military equipment to Ukraine. Maybe he believes that if he did that, then Putin would open up a new front in the Arctic. I don't know. But these lone individuals don't really have many others with whom to work with in the Canadian Parliament. And one should also bear in mind, as another factor here, is that Canadian national identity, as described by Janice Stein from the Munk Centre, is small c conservative, and therefore things change very slowly, and foreign policies of countries also change very slowly. So the idea that there would be some kind of radical shift if the Liberals were to replace the Tories is, I think, very unlikely. Yes, in the case of NDP, but not in the case of Liberals. Unfortunately, we also have a final, I would say, issue, which is that we live in an era of very weak political leaders. This is across the board. It's not a Canadian issue. Just look at Obama, and just look at Trump. My God, makes President Bush look like an intellectual. But look at European leaders, President Hollande of France, and other West European leaders. So we don't have the kind of historically the forceful leaders that we had of the past today. Maybe that will change, but I really don't see how a very weak Prime Minister Harper can be somehow improved upon by an equally weak Prime Minister Trudeau. I think that we need, therefore, to do a number of things. We need to vote strategically, if need be, in your riding. The key is to ensure NDP do not come to power. Whether it's Liberals or Tories, if Ukraine is an issue for you in these elections, then I really don't think it's going to be a major difference. As it wouldn't be the case in the case of Britain if it was Labour or Tories as well. But perhaps we need to get candidates to sign pledges that they will support, if they are elected to Ottawa, the sending of military aid to Ukraine and the support of a Canadian equivalent of what was adopted in US Congress, Canadian equivalent of the Ukraine Freedom Act, to be adopted in the Canadian Parliament in the first year of the new Parliament that's elected. Candidates should be advised that they will receive the support of the Ukrainian community in Canada if they sign pledges that they will back these two issues once they are elected. Because there is no such thing as a free lunch. Candidates should be pinned down for their promises that they make before elections so that they try to fulfill them once they are elected in power. The countries don't change radically over short periods of time. Their identities evolve over decades. Canadian identity has been changing since the 1970s, as has Britain's, and therefore the foreign policy of Canada and its military policy are a reflection of that. How that will be reflected in the years to come can be dependent on many things. If Trump is elected, this will be a disaster, I think, for Ukraine. If Trump is defeated and somebody else is elected, I think either another Republican or a Democrat, then that will inevitably be a person who will support the US Congress in the sending of military equipment to Ukraine. That in turn will inevitably apply pressure on Canada to follow suit. So there could be a change there in the offing. But that would only happen if either Liberals or Tories were in power in Ottawa, not NDP. So our priority is to ensure either of those two parties are elected. Thank you.